Human pulled an alien girl from the flooded ruin, but her soft question later struck deep. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The city was drowning. Streets once filled with life now stood silent. Only the sound of rushing water filled the air. John Miller had been moving through the wreckage for hours, his boots sinking into the mud as he navigated the flooded streets. The once towering skyscrapers that surrounded him were now reduced to twisted metal and concrete ruins. The flood had come without warning, catching everyone off guard. The entire city was a disaster zone, with water surging through the streets, submerging everything in its path. His job as a rescue worker was clear: save anyone he could, no matter how difficult or dangerous the task. But as he turned a corner, his eyes locked onto something that made him freeze in his tracks. Amidst the devastation, a figure lay motionless beneath a pile of rubble. It was a woman, a girl, to be exact, though she looked nothing like the humans John had known. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, shimmering almost like it was made of glass. Her hair was long and silvery, flowing like a river of light. Her eyes, when they opened, gleamed with an unsettling purple hue. John's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen anything like this before. But he couldn't just leave her there. Even if she wasn't human, she was in need of help. He moved quickly, his hands steady as he cleared the debris away from her fragile body. She was breathing, but barely. John's training kicked in. He lifted her into his arms, her body light, like it didn't belong in this world. As he carried her through the waterlogged streets, a strange feeling washed over him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or wonder, but something about this girl, this alien, had him questioning everything. He knew nothing about her. Her world, her language, her very existence was a mystery. But she was alive, and that was enough for him to keep moving forward. His mission was simple: save whoever was still out there. He had no idea how much this one act of kindness would change his life. But before he could fully process it, something happened that stopped him dead in his tracks. As he gently placed her down on a dry spot, she blinked slowly, her gaze soft but piercing. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at him with those violet eyes. And then, with the faintest whisper, she spoke the first words he had ever heard from her. "Why did you save me?" The question hung in the air, soft but profound. It wasn't what John had expected, and it certainly wasn't a question he was prepared to answer. Why had he saved her? What made him risk his life for someone, for something so foreign? The question struck deeper than he anticipated, sending a wave of uncertainty through him. He had acted on instinct, but her words made him pause. What if he had made the wrong choice? John stood there, staring at her, his mind racing as her question echoed in his ears. "Why did you save me?" The words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him, and for the first time since he had started his rescue efforts, he felt uncertain. He had never hesitated when pulling someone from danger before. It was simply what he did, what he was trained to do. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a human being. This was someone from a world far beyond his understanding. Someone who wasn't supposed to even exist in his reality. He found himself looking into her violet eyes, wondering if he had made the right choice. Was it because she needed help, or was there something else that drove him to act? Something deep inside him stirred, a mix of guilt, curiosity, and perhaps even a sense of compassion for this alien being. Her frail, shimmering form lay in front of him, fragile and unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin seemed to glow softly, almost as if she were part of the very light itself. He couldn't help but feel a strange connection to her, even though he had no idea where she came from, what she wanted, or if she could even understand him. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. John swallowed hard, trying to find his voice, but he realized that the question she asked wasn't something he could easily answer. He had always acted out of instinct. He saved people because it was his duty. But this situation was different. She wasn't just another human to rescue. This was something unknown, something alien. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in his mind. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low. I couldn't leave you there. The words felt weak, but it was the truth. He had acted without thinking, and now he was left wondering if he had done the right thing. You were alone, he added, though he wasn't sure if that was enough of an explanation. The girl didn't respond immediately. She just blinked slowly, her eyes still locked on his. It was as though she was trying to process what he had said, or maybe she was trying to understand why he had done it. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice soft and almost melodic. Alone? She repeated, as if the word was unfamiliar to her. John's brow furrowed. Yeah, he said, nodding. Alone. No one else around. Nothing but this mess. He gestured to the flooded ruins around them, the remnants of a city swallowed by the water. She didn't seem to react to his words at first, but then something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he noticed it. There was a sadness in her gaze, a deep, unspoken sorrow that John couldn't quite place. It was as though she understood the weight of his words in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and John felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just sympathy, it was something more. Maybe it was the isolation that both of them shared in that moment. He was stranded in a world that had been turned upside down, and she was stranded in his world, a world that was entirely alien to her. They were both lost, in different ways. As the silence stretched between them, John shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. But before he could speak, she broke the silence once more. I am Lyra, she said, her voice still soft, but this time with a hint of strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lyra. A name. A connection. John repeated it quietly to himself, trying to grasp the weight of it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something. Perhaps a friendship. Or maybe something more. Something neither of them could yet understand. He nodded at her. John. He said simply, unsure if she even knew what that meant. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. For the first time since the floodwaters had overtaken the city, John felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure where this journey would take them or what challenges they would face, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Not now. Not ever. John sat down beside Lyra, the sound of rushing water filling the silence between them. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. The city around them was unrecognizable, flooded and destroyed by the sudden storm. It felt as though the world was breaking apart. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, John found himself with someone who was just as lost as he was. Lyra sat next to him, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Her delicate features, so different from anyone John had ever known, were filled with curiosity and caution. She was still adjusting to everything. She hadn't spoken much since introducing herself, but John could feel that she was trying to understand the world she had found herself in. He could see her processing everything. The foreign language, the sounds, the air, the water. The world of humans was strange to her, and yet she was trying to navigate it the best she could. Are you okay? John asked, his voice breaking the quiet. She turned to him, her violet eyes meeting his, and nodded slowly. I am learning, she replied, her accent soft but clear. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that John couldn't ignore. She was learning, just as he was. Learning to survive in a world that neither of them had expected to find themselves in. Learning? John asked, trying to understand. Learning what? Lyra glanced around them, her gaze lingering on the shattered buildings and the waterlogged streets. How to live here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. How to survive. John couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for her. She had been pulled from a place he could never understand, and now she was thrust into this world of destruction and despair. She wasn't alone, but in many ways, she might as well have been. The thought weighed heavily on his heart. We'll figure it out, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed those words himself. He had no plan, no idea what the future would hold. But he couldn't just leave her. Not after what he had already done. You're not alone anymore, he added, his voice firm. Lyra turned to him again, her eyes searching his face as though she were trying to understand his words. Her face softened, and she nodded slowly. Not alone, she repeated, as though the words held a kind of comfort for her. The silence between them stretched once more, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable, It was a shared silence, an understanding that, for now, they were in this together. Do you want to keep moving? John asked after a while, breaking the quiet again. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be thinking, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. After a long pause, she nodded. Yes, she said. I will go with you. John stood up and offered his hand to her. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her touch gentle but steady. As she rose to her feet, John felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in days. There was a long road ahead of them, one that was uncertain and fraught with danger. But at least, for the moment, they had each other. And that was enough. Together, they began walking, their footsteps echoing softly through the empty streets, as they moved toward whatever the future might bring. The city had been abandoned for days, the streets eerily quiet except for the distant sound of water sloshing against debris. John and Lyra moved through the empty streets with a steady pace, neither speaking much, but both feeling a strange bond that had formed between them. Lyra had become more familiar with the surroundings, though her eyes were still wide with wonder at the strange new world she found herself in. It wasn't the same as the place she had come from, but it was all she had now. John, too, was adjusting, though in his case, the reality of the world around him weighed heavily on his shoulders. The water had started to recede, but the damage left behind was beyond anything he had expected. Buildings lay in ruins, their once proud structures now barely recognizable. Cars were overturned and piled up, and the streets had been turned into muddy, waterlogged paths. John had seen cities crumble before, but never like this. He could feel the heaviness of the situation pressing down on him, and yet he kept moving forward, his only focus on getting through it. Lyra had yet to speak much more than her initial words when they first met, but she seemed to be absorbing everything around her with a kind of quiet intensity. She had been through something unimaginable, something that had brought her to this world, and John couldn't help but wonder what it had been. Are you still okay? John asked, glancing at her as they walked. Lyra's gaze flickered over to him, and for a brief moment, he saw something in her eyes. Something deep, like she was carrying a weight of her own. She nodded slowly, her expression soft. I am still learning, she replied, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. John didn't push it further, but he could sense that there was more she wasn't sharing. He didn't want to pry. Not yet. The last few days had been a blur of exhaustion, survival, and trying to make sense of what had happened to them both. They were survivors now, and for the first time in days, John found a moment of calm. The road ahead of them was still uncertain. He wasn't sure where they were headed, only that they couldn't stay here in the ruins. He had no idea if there was anyone else left in the city, or if anyone had survived the flood. But what mattered now was getting through the day, one step at a time. There's a shelter a few miles ahead, John said, pointing down the road. We can rest there. It's not much, but it'll be safer than out here. Lyra glanced in the direction he pointed, and then back to him. She didn't say anything, but she gave a small nod, signaling that she trusted him. That was all he needed. The trust of someone who had come from a world so far away was a strange thing, but it was real. Together, they walked on, side by side, through the silence of the broken city. As they moved, John couldn't help but think about how their journey had changed them both. He wasn't the same person he had been before the flood. The world was different now. Lyra was different now, and he knew that this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about something deeper, something he didn't fully understand yet. But with Lyra by his side, he was determined to find out. John and Lyra continued their journey through the desolate city, the remnants of a once thriving place now submerged in chaos. The roads ahead were still uncertain, and each step they took felt heavier than the last. The shelter John had mentioned was in the distance, barely visible through the mist of rain and fog. They had been walking for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to settle into John's bones. He could feel his body aching from the strain, but he didn't dare show it. Lyra, however, seemed more resilient than he expected. She walked beside him, her steps light and graceful, as if the destruction around them was just another part of the world she had always known. It was hard to imagine that just a few days ago, she had been pulled from the wreckage of a world that was not his own. The bond between them had grown since then. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They had shared quiet moments, exchanged glances, and in that silence, they had begun to understand each other without words. Yet, there were still so many things unsaid between them. John wasn't sure if he was ready to ask the questions that lingered in his mind. Who was she really? Where did she come from? What had brought her to this world? What did it mean to be truly alone in a place so vast, so broken? They finally reached the shelter, a small building tucked away in what was once a busy district. The door creaked as John pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The air was stale, the room empty except for a few abandoned supplies. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and for now, that was all that mattered. Lyra immediately went to the corner of the room, her eyes scanning the space as though she were assessing it, familiarizing herself with her surroundings. John, meanwhile, checked the small window, making sure they were not being followed. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, the uncertainty of everything they had been through settling in. For a long time, they sat in silence. Lyra sat on the floor, her legs crossed, her head tilted slightly as she looked at John. She seemed curious, her violet eyes studying him intently. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "What will happen now?" she asked. John glanced at her, surprised by the question. It wasn't what he had expected her to say. "What do you mean?" he asked. Lyra's gaze didn't waver. "What happens after we survive this? What comes next?" The question took him off guard. John had never really thought that far ahead. For so long, it had just been about making it through the day, surviving the next moment. The thought of what came next had never crossed his mind. But now, with Lyra looking at him with such intensity, he couldn't ignore it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess we just keep going. We find others, if there are any. We rebuild, if we can. We survive. That's all we can do." Lyra nodded slowly, processing his words. She looked down at her hands for a moment, lost in thought. John could sense that there was more she wasn't saying, but for now, he didn't press. It was enough that she was starting to ask these kinds of questions. It was a sign of something. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe the desire to find meaning in the chaos they were living through. Lyra looked up at him again, her expression softening. "I will go with you," she said, her voice steady. "Wherever we go, I will follow." John felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words. It was a simple statement, but it meant more than she could know. "Thanks," he replied, his voice quiet. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of two people trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace. Maybe not everything was lost after all. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet survival. The city around them remained eerily still, the once bustling streets now nothing more than empty shells of their former selves. John and Lyra moved through the wreckage, searching for supplies and shelter, always cautious, always aware of the uncertainty that hung in the air. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done, and the world outside their small refuge felt vast and unforgiving. Lyra had grown more accustomed to the world she now found herself in, though there were still moments when her alien origins became apparent. Her curiosity about human technology was insatiable, and John found himself explaining things he had once taken for granted. He showed her how to start a fire, how to read a map, and how to use a flashlight. In turn, she taught him small things about her world, things that seemed simple to her but were beyond John's comprehension. She spoke of her home, a place far away, where the stars looked different and the air had a different texture. John listened, captivated by the stories she told. It wasn't just the differences that fascinated him, though. It was the way Lyra seemed to hold on to her past with such clarity, as though it was something she could never let go of. In contrast, John had little to say about his own world. His life before the flood had been simple, straightforward. He had never given much thought to his place in the grand scheme of things, always just living day to day, doing his job. But now, as he spent time with Lyra, he found himself questioning everything. What was his place in this new world? What did it all mean? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the wreckage, John and Lyra sat together on the roof of the shelter. It was the first time they had taken a break from their constant search for survival. The air was cool, and the world around them was silent except for the occasional rustling of wind. They had food, water, and a place to rest, but the unease of what lay ahead lingered. "Do you ever miss it?" John asked, his voice low as he stared at the setting sun. "Miss what?" Lyra's voice was gentle, but there was a sadness in it, a note of something unspoken. "Your world. Your people." Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, her violet eyes reflecting the colors of the fading light. She seemed to be lost in thought, her mind far away. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I miss the feeling of being whole," she said softly. "I miss the stars. I miss my people. But mostly I miss knowing who I am." The words hit John harder than he expected. He had never truly considered what it must be like for her, to be torn from everything she knew, from everything that made her who she was. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to be displaced like that, to feel like a stranger in a strange world. "I can't imagine what that must be like," John said quietly, turning to face her. "But you're not alone anymore." Lyra turned her gaze back to him, and for the first time, there was a faint smile on her lips. It was small, but it was there, a glimmer of something that John hadn't seen before. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. They sat in silence for a while, watching as the last traces of sunlight disappeared, leaving the world bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The night was calm, but John knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more questions, and more uncertainty. Still, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the survival instinct anymore. It was something deeper, something that told him that no matter what, he wasn't going to let Lyra face this world alone. Together, they would figure it out. Together, they would survive. The next morning, John woke to the sound of birds chirping in the distance. It had been a strange feeling, waking up in a place that had once been full of life, now quiet and still. The remnants of the city stretched out before him, broken and decaying, but there was something different in the air today. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was just the sense that they had made it through another night. Either way, the silence felt less oppressive. Lyra was already awake, sitting near the small fire they had built the night before. She was looking out over the waterlogged streets, her gaze distant, almost lost. Her presence seemed to belong here now, as if she had slowly begun to accept her place in this strange world. John sat up and rubbed his eyes, still trying to shake off the fog of sleep. He hadn't slept much, his mind kept racing, always wondering what came next. But this morning, something felt different. He stood and walked over to Lyra, who hadn't acknowledged his presence yet. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. Lyra turned to him, offering a small nod. "Morning," she replied softly, her voice as calm as ever. John sat beside her, following her gaze toward the horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a shared peace. "You've been quiet," John said after a while. "What's on your mind?" Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes thoughtful. "I am thinking about where we go next," she said. "What happens now?" John looked down at the dirt beneath him, considering her words. They had made it this far, but the uncertainty of the future still loomed over them. He had no answers. No one did. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we keep going. We find out what's left of the world, and we try to rebuild. If there are others out there, we'll find them. If not, we make do." Lyra seemed to absorb his words, her eyes scanning the broken city in front of them. "You still have hope," she said, almost in awe. John smiled a little, though it was faint. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I do." Lyra turned her gaze back to him, her expression softening. "I want to see it," she said. "The world you talk about. I want to understand it more." There was a sense of determination in her voice, a quiet strength that John hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was trying to understand, to make sense of everything that had happened. "We'll see it," John said, his voice more confident now. Together, the two of them stood up and gathered what little gear they had left. John slung his pack over his shoulder, and Lyra adjusted the small bag she carried. They had no clear plan, but the thought of moving forward together brought a sense of reassurance. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held. But they had each other, and that, for now, was enough. As they walked away from the shelter, leaving the remnants of the city behind them, John felt a shift inside himself. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The world had changed, and so had he. But perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. With Lyra by his side, He was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. The days passed slowly as John and Lyra made their way through the wreckage of the city. The ruins were endless, and yet, each day they managed to find small signs of life. The world around them felt as if it had been shattered beyond repair, yet there was still hope, flickering faintly in the distance. They found what little food and water they could, and each night, they shared stories. Not the grand, heroic kinds, but simple stories. Stories about the places they had come from, the small things they missed, and the strange new world they now had to navigate. One morning, after a restless night filled with unsettling dreams, John woke to find Lyra sitting by the window of their makeshift shelter, staring out into the desolate landscape. Her silhouette was bathed in the soft light of the early sun, and for a moment, she seemed almost distant, lost in thoughts John couldn't reach. "Are you okay?" John asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Lyra didn't immediately respond, her eyes lingering on something far beyond the horizon. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I am learning," she said, almost to herself. "Learning what?" John asked, sitting beside her. "Learning how to belong," she replied, turning her gaze to him. "How to be a part of this world." John looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. She had come from a world so far removed from his own, and now she was trying to find a place here, in the ruins of a once thriving city. He couldn't imagine what that must feel like, to be so displaced, to have everything you knew and understood ripped away in an instant. But as he sat next to her, he realized that she was not just surviving, she was adapting. She was learning, just as he was. "You don't have to do it alone," John said softly. "We're in this together." Lyra's lips parted, and for a moment, she looked as if she might say something more. But then, she simply nodded, her expression softening. The weight of her loneliness, the loneliness she had carried from her distant world, seemed to lessen just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. They didn't have all the answers. There was still so much unknown, so much uncertainty. But they had found something important. They had found each other. And that made everything a little more bearable. "Do you think we'll ever find others?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet. John thought about it for a moment, considering the vastness of the world around them. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if we do, we'll be ready. We'll keep going, one step at a time." Lyra nodded again, a quiet determination settling into her features. It was a small moment, a quiet conversation between two people who had been thrown together by fate, but it meant everything. For the first time in a long while, John felt like there was a purpose in what they were doing. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about finding meaning, about rebuilding, about creating something in the midst of all the destruction. "Let's keep moving," John said after a long pause, standing up and offering her a hand. Lyra took it without hesitation, and together, they stepped out into the new day. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to face it alone. John and Lyra continued their journey through the devastated landscape, the weight of the world still hanging over them. The days blended into each other, filled with moments of silence and small exchanges that kept them moving forward. They had become accustomed to the rhythm of survival, searching for supplies, finding shelter, and always keeping an eye on the horizon. Despite the challenges, something had shifted within John. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting to believe in the possibility of something beyond just making it through each day. The idea of rebuilding, of finding others, had begun to take root in his mind. And Lyra, though still distant at times, had begun to share more of herself. Her stories of the stars and the people she had left behind had become more frequent, each one a glimpse into the world she had once known. It was clear that she was still processing everything, but there was a quiet strength in her, one that John had come to admire. One afternoon, as they walked through the remnants of what had once been a park, John noticed a shift in Lyra. She had been unusually quiet that morning, her eyes distant, her steps slower than usual. They had found an old, rusted car, half submerged in the muddy water, and were scavenging through it when she stopped, her hand resting on the side of the vehicle. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Lyra said softly, her voice barely audible. John turned to her, concern rising in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, taking a step closer. Lyra hesitated, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Everything is so broken," she said. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending it's okay." Her words hit John harder than he expected. He had never heard her sound so vulnerable. She had always been so composed, so steady in the face of everything that had happened. It was hard for him to imagine how she must be feeling, torn from everything she had ever known, dropped into a world that felt foreign and hostile. "You don't have to pretend," John said gently. "I get it. This world, everything, it's hard. But you're not alone in this. I'm here with you." Lyra finally turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face as though trying to understand if he truly meant it. After a long moment, she nodded. "I know," she whispered. "I know." They stood there for a while, the sound of the wind rustling the trees in the distance. The world was quiet, the devastation all around them. But in that moment, they weren't just survivors. They were two people who had found a connection in the midst of it all. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Together, they would face whatever came next. As they resumed walking, John couldn't help but feel that, despite the uncertainty of everything, there was a sense of hope beginning to take root. Within him, maybe the world was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something new from the ashes. The path ahead was still unclear, but with Lyra by his side, John felt a renewed sense of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, step by step.